Welcome to It's All in Your Head podcast. This is episode 19. And today we're going to have a candid discussion about race. And we just want to let you know that this is just our opinions, Tara and I. So, Tara, how are you feeling today about this discussion?
I'm ready. I'm ready for it, I guess.
Yeah, because we've had some talks about this, and it gets kind of passionate between us as we talk about it. At a personal level, we just never have had anything to discuss because between the two of us, there's never anything to discuss. And so we were sitting there talking, well, what do we talk about? What do we talk about? Because there's nothing to talk about between the two of us. But then we got talking about it more on a world level. There's a lot to talk about.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the things that have come up have been just how, like for me, just how discouraged I get that in order to kind of promote a political agenda, it seems like um, the race thing starts being brought in, and African American people get outraged, purposely outraged in some way, or purposely triggered in some way to to be brought in and combined with a political issue that's going on. And I get very upset by that because I feel like it's a manipulation. And I feel like that when the political party that's trying to do this has already gotten whatever it is they're trying to get, that then it's all going to die down, and that the changes that have been promised or hoped for are not going to happen. And that's what makes me really upset about it. What are your thoughts on that?
And I think my contention has been that, yeah, that's probably true, but I think that the issues that are being brought to the forefront need to be out in the forefront because things like the Black Lives Matter movement, but my approach being the mother of 3 Black adult sons is very different than what someone else could think. So for me, it's been important because it shines light, I believe, on the injustices that continue to occur. And I'm less fearful, to be honest, about my children than I used to be because it's caused a certain level of education. So, I mean, I don't know if you see the millions of videos on YouTube where as soon as someone's pulled over by the police, they pull out their phone and they start recording, or different things like that. Just, I just feel like a level of accountability has been added. And it's unfortunate that it's been used in a political way, but I think that some of that is necessary because it keeps kind of pushing the movement that I think needs to be pushed forward, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe for a small increment of something gets improved every time it happens. And that's true.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about, I remember a training that you and I both went to, and it was all about it's kind of shaking up on the inside of us some of these ideas and the different things that we do. I don't know if you remember that training, but it was when it was at the height of this thing. And I was saying, yes, I feel like I've had to have the conversation with all of my boys about what to do if you get pulled over by the police, or, hands at 10 and 2 and all those different kinds of things. And the facilitator challenged me and was like, but why? I don't know. Do you remember that?
I do remember. Mm-hmm.
And I could not fathom and even though he said he was playing devil's advocate, but he was saying what in essence was happening is that we, or me in that instance, was allowing something to cause me to do something else because I didn't feel like there was any other option. So then the challenge was, what are other options you can find? Mm-hmm. You remember all of that? And I don't know if that was part of the growing edge thing or what it was, but I do remember that. I remember that very distinctly. And I didn't have an answer to that because I felt like it was my responsibility as a mother to make sure I could do everything within inside of my power to make sure my children were educated.
Yeah, because you didn't want anything to happen.
Right.
And I hear that from a lot of my clients, who have sons, that they want to make sure that they're safe in that way. When did you, well, let's kind of talk about this. When did you as a person first become aware that you were of a different color than other people, and that it had a difference for you?
From birth would be coy to say that, but as far as I can remember, it's always been a distinction. And I remember I read the Toni Morrison book, The Bluest Eye.
Mhm.
And I remember identifying so much with the young girl who put the towel on her head and pretended to be white. Because even from a very, very early age, something made me feel like it would be better to be white than who I was back then. I don't know what it was. I don't know where that came from. I don't know. There was always a comparison. And I remember distinctly my grandmother saying things like, nobody white is better than you. Like it was like it had to be said for some reason. So when I can say as far back as I remember, I know that there's been differences. And then those differences even get played up in a way of, I would even say when we start talking about the whole colorism thing within inside of the Black community, it's played up. So
Mhm.
there are different layers to it instead of just what we see on the surface, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
So what about you? Like, when did you first realize there were differences? And how did that look?
For me, that's interesting because I grew up in an all white community, really, because I grew up in Idaho, but there were a lot of actually Hispanic people in our community. But my father had grown up really poor and had to live on really the only area of Idaho Falls where the African American people lived. And he had a lot of prejudices, I think, because of ways he was treated as one of the only white kids living in that area. And he didn't have, he called people derogatory names. And my mother wouldn't let us repeat those names. We were not allowed to call anybody a name that was derogatory. And so she corrected us all the time. Um, and even down to the point where I think I might have said this before, we couldn't call policemen cops because in her mind that was a disrespectful name. We had to call them policemen. And so I became aware that there were derogatory names for, races and things. But I think for me, growing up in what was a very male centric religious community, I was more wishing I was a man, kind of like you were trying to pretend you were white. I was very tomboyish, wishing that I was male because they got more attention, they had more privileges, that kind of thing. And I recognized being a woman was not. Um, I got ignored a lot being a woman, and recognized that more as a child than I did race. But as I got older, and for me, I think starting to work for an airline in my early 30s, where people, because they come from all over the world, work for an airline so they can go back home and visit family. You get a lot of people that work for an airline that come from all over the world. And so it's kind of a microcosm of an ideal world where everybody from every different culture works within an airline, and they work together and they do it in a very respectful way. And for me, that was my very first experience of what an ideal world might look like. And I loved it. I loved it that it was multicultural and that we worked really hard within the airline to even have specific days that we celebrated different people's cultures and different things like that. And it was great. It was like what the ideal world would look like. And so that's what I would love to see the world look like that.
And I think I've always been aware, of course, hyper aware that I was Black, hyper aware of that. And the other part of it I remember taking more of a militant approach to what I experienced. I remember when I was even applying to go to college, I got accepted out of high school to every college I applied to, but I chose to go to Michigan State, not because it was the best school, but they had had an uprising of the Black students who took over the student administration building and demanded some changes be made. And for some reason, that was so attractive to me. But I think as clinicians, I want to talk a little bit about the psyche behind that. So, because I had felt so powerless growing up, I was trying to be any place where I felt like I could have some semblance of power or be in control of my own life or in control of something. And that's what was attractive to me. So I think that that also can speak to maybe what is happening with other people. I don't know, when you hear me say that, what do you think about?
You know, I think that that's kind of true of everybody, that when we feel powerless, we do try to find a place where we can feel powerful. And yeah, I think that that's true. How did that play out for you?
I joined that organization. That was the first thing I did when I got to campus. I joined
Mhm.
that organization. After then, I joined the Nation of Islam, and I think we talked about that before. But I was in the Nation of Islam for 10 years
Mhm.
before I got out of the Nation of Islam and tried to get my life into some kind of what I would call productive order for myself, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that's where it sent me. It sent me to a place where I guess I learned a lot of stuff about myself, but I also found myself where I did not know that I was in any kind of trouble mental health wise, if that makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah.
So that that's what happened for me. And I think still it was a valid experience because it doesn't change who I am as a person. I think I still sometimes look for the fight, but in a way that is more productive. Or I would say I don't shrink down from the fight.
Right.
I'll stand right in the face of it and say, like, let's go. Let's see what this is gonna bring, because it's usually I believe I come from a place of what I would call righteous indignation, where I believe that there's some wrong that's been done and I want to see that wrong righted.
Yeah, and I'm a little more slow to do that, but I definitely have that inside of me. But I think I did the same thing with religiously too, where I became kind of religiously fanatic for a little bit, and had to kind of temper that at some point. And like you said, not aware of how the mental illness part of it fit in
Mm-hmm.
to that too, where I became extremely controlling, and it just gets worse as you get older. At some point in time, it all has to come to a head,
Mm-hmm.
and it did. And I had to change my life into something that was sustainable, because it just isn't sustainable to be that way over a long period of time. And so that's what's happened to me now, is I've just had to let go of my need to control anything but myself, and how I perceive the world and how I handle my life moving forward.
Thank you for joining us for It's All in Your Head podcast. Remember to subscribe, like, share, and please comment. Whatever mental health questions you have, we will be happy to answer them in future podcasts.
Okay, so another question that came up was, how have our kids experienced racial inequality? And I think it's been so much better for our kids. And my grandkids even better, because I have a granddaughter who's 14, and she just doesn't have any like there's no bullying of the gay kids or anything at school. There's no there's a lot of different races in her school, because she lives in an area of where she lives where there are a lot of different races, and she's actually a minority. She's a white kid that is a minority in her school, and there's no bullying, there's no problem with that, like there would have been when I was in school, you know. And yeah, so I think it's quite different for her, especially my granddaughter. What about for you?
I think that I started to notice the differences more with my youngest son, who will be 24. And when he was in high school, he was one of the popular kids. He's an athlete. And I watched him one day. I forget where I was at school, but all of the kids had kind of segregated themselves out into different groups. And he said, those are the emo kids, those are these kids, because he was identifying the groups for me. But I watched the ease that he navigated between each group with. And it was really something to watch, because he was always very much himself. And to this day, he has the most diverse group of friends, I think, than all of my other children. So just watching that. And he also has some very different ideas about race and culture that were important to him. And for him, it was the person genuine? So the standards that he used to measure who could be his friend or not had changed, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So
I like that. That's awesome. So yeah, moving forward, my hope is for kids, the next generations, is that they do use different criteria, that their criteria is more about the integrity of the person, rather than the color of their skin.
definitely. So this is one I think is really crucial. And we talked a little bit offline about this, and I want to kind of bring this back to the surface. So how have external factors influenced your thinking about racial difference, good or bad, people, things, the media, etc.? What would you say?
Well, I have to tell you that when I first moved to Georgia and I was working in the west end of Atlanta, which is where the nonprofit organization where we met is. And I think in that organization, I was one of just a handful of white people working there, really. And I had, and it was planted right down in an African American community. And I think at first I hadn't really experienced that type of poverty and what happens for people in that type of poverty. It was quite shocking. And I felt really sad. And I think the things I felt the saddest about is that there were no fathers protecting their daughters. And so I was doing trauma therapy on adults young women who had one who'd been impregnated when she was 11, encouraged by her friends to get pregnant or to have sex when she was 11. And there's no fathers protecting their daughters from that. I know that my dad protected me. I mean, to the point where a boyfriend kept me out too late, and my dad came looking for me, when I was like 15. I wasn't allowed to date or even be with boys until I was 16 years old. That was the family rule. And my dad was there to enforce that, And so there weren't fathers there protecting the daughters. And you kind of saw that. People were describing to me how they were not encouraged to finish high school. In fact, they were made fun of for wanting to finish high school. Just different things that were really different that I had never really encountered and didn't have a mind frame for that, of how that would be to be experiencing that and what it would be like to be growing up in that way. And it made me feel really sad that was the kind of struggles that someone had to go through in order to, and what it would be like to have to grow up like that, and how you would break out of that. And I could see why it would take generations and generations to break out of that, or how you would be, how it would go on for generations. And it was just, I guess, sad and discouraging at times was kind of how it felt.
I would say it's funny you mentioned that. I kind of giggled because we had the rule that we couldn't date till we were 16 too. That was that rule. And I know that feeling because even though, I mean, we wouldn't have known that we were poor. I mean, that's just how it was. But I remember feeling very safe with the ideas I had of my father and the things that he did for me. The fact that anytime that I felt like I needed him, he was there. And to not have that, even though he was a very quiet person, he wasn't the kind of sit down and have fatherly types of chats or anything like that. But just his presence was something. And I want to say of that area, not because it's a primarily Black area, but there are people of many different races there. And whether it was even Caucasian clients, you would see the same thing. So I want to kind of make that caveat because I don't want people thinking that, oh, I think that it was very much the area and what we saw a lot of. And so there's some interesting things because you and I are older and I don't mind being older, but we kind of came along before the age of crack cocaine. And so I remember being at a training where this was years and years ago when I was first coming into the field. And the person was saying that what we were getting into was the first generation of people who could have had crack addicted grandparents.
Wow.
So there's some social things that began to start missing when that whole crack cocaine phenomenon came along. Because if we couldn't depend on anybody, we could depend on grandma or big mom, whatever you would call her. But if grandma or big mom was hooked on crack, who could these young people depend on?
Mm-hmm.
And so it brings to mind some of these social things that had not quite ever really been addressed,
Right.
you know, and the attempts to address them failed miserably, like the whole war on drugs and, you know, young people being given 25-year sentences for crack cocaine in, you know, comparison to what they would have gotten if they were selling powder cocaine, just these different kinds of things. So when you were speaking, it brought that up for me, that thought, like, what is this? What's happening? Because we have seen the world through a few generations, and it's just so like that watching it on TV or the media presence or whatever it is, it's really kind of mind-blowing when you think about it in that context of what we actually have the opportunity to see that's happening.
Mm-hmm. Now that makes sense. And in fact, we had it was the training I think that you were referring to talked about it being more of a class distinction rather than a race distinction.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And the class, and that is true that the poverty level was more of what the issue was than the racial thing.
Yep.
And
yep. And I remember even telling people, now I love the Obamas. I was like always an Obama fan. But I remember the first time when President Obama was being elected, I told people, make no mistake, yes, I'm very excited that we have an African-American president. I am very excited about that. But make no mistake, the color that matters more than anything is green. And we have to be careful how we approach this issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when we make it so that whoever is on the bottom of the pay scale, so to speak, is able to make enough money to survive and things like that, then, you know, things are going to be different.
Mm-hmm. And I think about, I guess this is a political thing, I'm not sure, but when we talk about the issues of minimum wage, my stance is very different than it was when I earned minimum wage.
Okay.
So and it's just the thinking of it, because people are saying, oh my gosh, people are going to be making at least $15 an hour. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But then the businesses that have to pay that,
Mm-hmm.
who some of them that are very probably just scraping by,
Right.
are not going to be able to afford to pay that as a minimum wage.
Right.
So I think, like I said, my stance when I earned the minimum wage was very different. And I don't even want to say how much it was when I first started working. People would be surprised how much minimum wage was when we were first old enough to be able to work. But I think now, as a business owner, thinking of expanding and having to hire someone, it makes you think differently about the capacity of your business and the level of business and how it will look when this change takes place. So I'm not saying anyone doesn't deserve that, because everyone deserves to make what is considered to be a living wage. But on the flip side of that, as a business owner, it makes us have to think a little bit differently. Would you agree with me or
I
not?
agree. It definitely is. And then you think about, well, if you just raise your prices to accommodate that, well, then you've made things out of bounds for everybody anyway. And the whole thing just doesn't, then you've just made, all you've done is raise the cost of living along with the cost of wages, which doesn't help anything anyway. And yeah, it all just becomes harder and harder to figure out, how would you do that? How would you make that doable?
Mm-hmm. Something else that came to mind, Michelle, we were talking, I think maybe yesterday or the day before, and you had done a workshop about race for a company. And I remember you were talking to me a little bit about the difficulties you were having. I kind of want to explore that a little bit, because you did say something very distinctly, and it's so different, because I'm going to say this and I might get in trouble, but communicating with you is not like communicating with the average white person. It's just not. You exercise higher order thinking a lot easier than other people that I've dealt with. And so one of the statements that you made was you were talking about how difficult it was, and trying to get certain, maybe even Caucasian people, to understand that different point of view. And you said because white people don't listen to Black people. And when I thought about that, I'm like, I want you to explore that a little bit and talk about the difficulty that you were having, even trying to facilitate that discussion.
Oh yeah, I was trying to facilitate discussions for a company between white and Black people, and I it was trying to it was during the George Floyd situation, and oh my gosh, it's going to make me want to cry. But white people were coming on and saying, well, don't all lives matter? Why do we have to make Black lives matter right now? And I was trying to explain to them that, and I used it something that I had read on the internet. It's like, okay, well, if someone came to you and said, my grandmother just died, and you said, oh, well, all grandmothers die. How does that sound? And one guy said, well, it sounds kind of insensitive. And I said, well, yeah, all grandmothers do die, but right now your grandmother died. And he thought about it for a minute, and he said, well, so me saying all lives matter right now is a little insensitive. And it finally kind of got through to him, but it was just really difficult to help people understand that their insensitivity. And what was happening is that the Black people on these calls were showing up less and less, because it just was taking I was just having to really, really talk to the white people to get them to understand why this was so painful for the Black people on the call. And eventually the company stopped the discussions, because after a little while, none of the Black people were showing up on the calls. And I'm sorry, I'm referring to people white and Black, and that may not be appropriate, but
It's fine.
That's how it
You know
went.
what? We are not going to worry about being PC right now while we're having this discussion. It is what it is. So,
Yeah,
you
and
know,
it was discouraging, and it just made me realize that they just didn't feel listened to, and that's why they were not showing up. I was trying to help them to help them describe something, and the people were not hearing it, and it was just they just were not being heard, you know. Thank you for joining It's All in Your Head podcast. I just want to remind you to subscribe, like, share, and comment below. Thank you.
and that's something, because I know, again, I'm referring to my age a lot this time, but every decade there is something that happens that becomes like a racial powder keg. And I have sat through more multicultural, more racial discussion. And I had said in 2020, I just wasn't going to do it because the company that I worked for during the day decided that they were going to have these discussions. And when I tell you, I was just not for it. I wasn't going to do it. And my idea was I was not going to sit in and have a conversation about race with people who didn't really care about race, who were, because right now it's the chic thing to do, and that nothing was really going to change. So, I had preconceived notions about it from the very beginning. And so at the very last minute, I decided to participate. And in doing so, it was like, okay. And it still felt very much like the same. It really did. But to get to hear people discuss their own experiences, one woman even said, based on your definition of what being a racist is, I think I'm a racist because I do have preconceived notions about other people. And it was just interesting to just sit there and hear that and kind of try to digest that and try to have a new frame of mind about it, which I don't know if I succeeded because I still, like I said, felt very much the same, like, okay, here we go, another conversation. But I was hoping that there would be another layer of at least corporate accountability to the things that were being promised, and we'll see. We'll see what happens with that. But I think about that, like how do we get people to hear that there can be a difference? Or are people so polarized that this is just how it's going to be? What do you think?
How can we do that? Let me think about this. I think that I think that, Tara, the way that it would have to happen is if people really just stopped talking about each other based on the color of their skin and started talking about each other based on other properties. If they really just started to refer to each other in a different way. I think if we keep talking about racial issues as if, I mean, if we keep making it an issue, it's going to stay an issue. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Because I don't know.
But then I would say it's an issue because it's an issue. So how do we begin to change it? Now, I would say this. You and I had never really had a true conversation about race. But I think that there's some specific reasons for that because we connected on different levels that had nothing to do with that based on the things that we had in common.
Right.
But in order to know that, we had to have a different level of intimacy, I think.
Right.
I don't know if it could be, but I don't know if it's possible to get the world at large to begin to operate with that kind of emotional intelligence, I guess, that where instead of first and foremost looking at what's different, then we start that process with trying to identify what's the same by having meaningful conversation. I don't know, but I think that, and I think that the media is attempting, and I think that's what they try to do, and a lot of it can be inflammatory because now you see diversity in dating, which used to be illegal, but that's in every show pretty much. You
Sure.
see diversity in sexuality, that's in every show pretty much. So I don't know. You see diversity of religion. You do more so. So I'm just wondering what.
Children do it naturally. Children don't pay attention to
That's
race,
true.
play with each other. And somewhere along the way, somebody has to teach them that's a problem. So if nobody teaches them that's a problem, they're fine, you know? So maybe that's the key, is to have it shown in the movies and everywhere that that's all how it's supposed to be. And then since they naturally do that as children, they'll just grow up and naturally do it as adults if nobody ever tells them that it's different, you know? The media, and movies and media and things are really powerful in shaping us. So maybe that is the key.
So now on the flip side, because that's our ideal world, and me and you could probably live there very comfortably, but that's not the rest of everyone right now. So how do we begin the process of and so it's two things, because there's another thing that I think has to happen also. We have to acknowledge people's pain. That's just reality. And I know that there's a lot of racial trauma that exists. I just think in the treatment setting, I've made it very comfortable for my clients to discuss that if they need to. And I think that that's also important, because I'm not denying anybody's pain, anybody's fear. I know some of the things that I've gone through. I've been in my car or in the car with my husband when we've been pulled over. I remember even when I lived in LA years and years ago, I was pregnant and we were pulled over by the police and demanded to get out of the car. And I got out of the car. My husband at the time had to get on the ground. And when they saw that I was big and pregnant, they didn't make me get on the ground. They just said, get back in the car. We don't even know why we were stopped. I still to this day don't know why we were stopped and treated that way.
How scary.
But I mean, I don't remember guns being drawn on us, but I think that would have been a fear. And I just remember us getting back in the car and driving home like, oh, here we go. That it was just, another thing. So, I don't know. I guess I'm kind of at a loss for words as to how to begin too, because I think that saying, oh, all lives matter kind of thing denies some of the trauma that has happened. And I know, like you said, like that's not your sentiment. And I don't know anybody who I've talked to who would continue that conversation. So I guess I've never really talked to someone who's had that type of an opposing view.
Yeah.
And I don't even know what that conversation would be like.
Because I don't know if there's a way to heal it, and I don't know if there's a way to make up for it. I wish there were. I mean, if there was a way to say, I'm sorry to African American people, I'm so sorry for what my ancestors did. How can I make it up to you? And if they said, please do this, this, and this for me, and we could say, okay, and then just do it, I think that would be a cure. Do you know what I mean? But I don't know that there's any way to make that happen. And I don't know that you would even know what to ask for. Right. What would you ask for? If I said, I am so sorry for what my ancestors did to your people. How can I make it up to you? What would you say to that?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. And I guess because because I have to think not only about myself, but I have to think about generations before me and then generations after me. And that would take more research and time than just to answer in the moment. You
Yeah.
know, I could say, stop treating me poorly, but then what does that mean? I could
Right.
say, have more equity in hiring, but what does that mean?
Right.
You know, I could say, stop killing my children in the street. Like, we know what that means, even though they're not my biological children, but figuratively. You
Right.
know, I've never watched the George Floyd video. And I
Oh,
was watching a show where it's SWAT and it's new, like the new season. And they did this whole thing about they were it's set in LA and it talked about the Rodney King riots. And I lived in LA during that time.
mhm.
So I remember that time very vividly. And so I was watching it, but they did this, it brings tears to my eyes just thinking about it. But they did this thing where they were walking and the announcer was saying, these were George Floyd's last words. And by the time she got to the end of that, I was just bawling,
Me too.
because I mean, like I
Mhm.
said, I feel it now because it was just like the level of, I don't know. And I don't know, I didn't know him. So why, as Tara Ray, do I feel it so deeply? So we've got to be able to make a connection between that and what people are going through so that we have more of an understanding. I also saw a weird show, and it's the same kind of thing, but it was called Lovecraft and Country, because you know I am so into the supernatural type of shows.
Mhm.
And it's set during the time of um, I want to say where Jim Crow was very popular in the South.
Mhm.
And it was one woman who, she is a witch or something. And so she was not able to die, but she had made a connection with a Black woman. And they were all talking about what happened to Emmett Till and the different things that happened. And she was saying to this person who's now her friend, you know, I'm sorry you went through. She said, you cannot tell me that you're sorry unless you understand what it's like to go through something like that. So this woman paid people to actually kill her the way that Emmett Till was killed. And that was the way that she decided she had, you know, when she came back to life, she decided she then had a better understanding of what was going on with the public outcry that was happening at the time. So it's a lot. It's so many different layers. And how do we experience, I mean, how do we get there? Because it's one thing to hear what can I do to help, but it's another thing to hear maybe the empathy in it.
Mhm.
Because what you get from most people is, let's just do something so we can move beyond this,
Mhm.
instead of what we would consider to be really clear and just like clear, open dialogue about changes that need to be made, and not to have the feeling that now that we're talking about it, people are getting used. Do you know what I mean? That we can let that be the fact, but we still use it to an advantage that is positive and not negative, or that doesn't benefit, the 1%, that actually benefits society in totality. I don't know how we would get there. I think that it's it's a valid conversation that we probably should continue. And then because there's so many different factors, even coming from the spiritual view, I know that the Bible says you pray for your leaders. So let's
Mhm.
do that. What does that look like? How do we make
Mhm.
sure that that continues to happen, and that we're not so focused on what people are doing and we can be more focused on what God is doing? Like there, like I said, it's so many layers. So I don't know. I'm at a loss, but I'm happy we're having this conversation. Thank you for joining us for It's All in Your Head podcast. And remember,
Mental health matters.
and if you don't deal with your stuff, it's going to deal with you.
Bye.